Greetings and welcome to Mediocre Minis. We move forward with painting the Hivestorm terrain. Well, more specifically, this is the Volkus Rubens terrain set that just so happened to come in the Hivestorm Kill Team box. It's just finally time to get around to actually painting it. Now, first things first, of course, once the terrain is built, it needs a prime, just like everything else, and I primed it black. I used a rattle can of matte black primer from the Army Painter. Just a simple rattle can and a quick coat of all of the paint, and the primer served very, very well into getting a really nice solid prime on all of the miniatures. Now, once the primer was dry, it was time to, well, actually paint it. And to paint it, I used something a little bit different. I took some inspiration from Jeremy from Black Magic Craft, and he specializes and creates a lot of terrain for tabletop games. And one of the things that he has recommended over the years, and something that I've latched onto, is sometimes using super cheap paint for your terrain. And I did that. I used actually Craft Smart paint from Michael's. It's a craft store here in the States, and I used a lot of that. Maybe $1, $1.50 per bottle. If you're interested or you're unfamiliar with Jeremy and his work, I'll have some of his work linked down below. Definitely check him out. Anyway, moving on to actually painting this terrain. I started off with Craft Smart Dark Gray, and I didn't really use a traditional painting style. I mostly dry brushed. I dry brushed almost all of this terrain, for instance. And to do so, I used a puffy, cheap makeup brush. Makeup brushes are pretty fantastic for dry brushing. They are large, poofy, and you can cover a lot of area pretty quickly. And plus they're cheap, you don't have to worry too much about ruining or destroying fancy paintbrushes. So I took some of this dark gray paint, put it onto a dry palette, dabbed on a little bit to a poofy makeup brush, cleaned some of it off just like regular dry brushing, and then just went to town on, well, all of it. I didn't really care too much about what area was being covered. I just wanted to cover everything in this dark gray. Since I primed the terrain black, any tight nooks or crannies that I couldn't quite get into with a poofy makeup brush, well, they were black. And this is ruins and terrain and old, and it would be fine if it was perfectly darker or some of the primer showing through. This actually took some of the longest, the actual initial base coat with the dark gray. There was a lot of terrain to cover. It took a lot of paint. I used about almost half of this to cover every bit of terrain. Now, of course, I'm using a lot more. This is cheaper paint. The coverage isn't nearly the same as it is with regular miniature paint. But for like $1.50 and good enough coverage, I ain't going to complain. Don't worry, even though it's cheaper paint, we're going to clean that up and take care of that at the very end to make sure it doesn't rub off. But over time, I eventually got all of the terrain covered with just this dark gray. And once that was done, I moved on to, well, just regular gray. Again, this is by Craft Smart, simple acrylic paint, and did a light dry brush all over the terrain bits. So a light dry brush all over with the gray. This went a lot faster and was a lot easier than the first step because I was using a lot less and I didn't need nearly as much paint to get some of those highlights and sharp edges. And finally, once that was all done, I used a small amount of vanilla Craft Smart paint again to hit some of the highest points and the sharpest of edges all around all of the terrain bits. That surprisingly went very quick after the initial base coat was complete. After I finished all of the main parts of the terrain with the gray, dark gray, and vanilla dry brushing, I moved on to, well, say, the doors and windows, or what used to be doors and windows. For all the doors, I wanted them to stand out, so I actually used another cheap paint. This is actually from Deco Art, relatively similar. I think it was a few dollars more per bottle, but it was, well, Rich Espresso. And I wanted something closer to a bronze, a dark gold, something a little bit deeper for what I wanted to do later with some verdigris. I didn't want to go silver with the doors. And also I had other ideas for silver in the future. And I used again, makeup brush. They were smaller makeup brushes, but still makeup brushes to cover the vast majority of all of these areas. Mostly some doors and a few different types of window frames. Some of the frames look kind of fancy, and I figured, you know what, that would look really good in this color as well. So I base coated with the rich espresso. Now, I didn't want to make too much of a mess, so after I got all the large areas done for doors and windows, I actually switched to a cheap synthetic brush to actually go in with a little bit more detail around some of the edges. Parts of the door frame, areas close to where the stonework and other metal bits would be. I didn't want to be too messy with this part, so I used a, cheap brush to get in there and paint. Once all of the bronze was done, I used a tiny bit of Splendid Gold, another Deco Art cheap metallic paint, to do a little bit of highlighting in the same way that I used the gray and eventually vanilla with the rest of the terrain. When that was all completed, I moved on to the, we'll say the floor, the platform areas. Areas where minis can stand that are mostly destroyed because they are ruins. And to do that, I was originally going to use, again, some cheap craft paint, but mine turned very, very gloopy. It's a technical term, gloop. And instead of that, I just moved to, dark silver. It is a paint by Pro Acryl. There wasn't as much of this area that I needed covered, so it wasn't too big of a deal to actually get in there with some of regular miniature paint as opposed to, cheap paint. Again, a heavy dry brush was used for all of these areas, and if you're worried about getting into some of the nooks and crannies, here's a pretty easy way you can help prevent any issues. I used a piece of, it used to be part of a blister pack that I got from Reaper Miniatures, but you can use an old credit card, postcards, sturdy piece of paper, piece of cardboard, whatever you particularly have, effectively as a rough edge. A way you can almost block your painting. Think of it as kind of like using painter's tape, but a little bit easier to use and a lot more mobile. In doing so, I was able to really get in there with the silver, particularly on the areas that a miniature would stand on, without really having to worry about getting the rest of the terrain or the walls covered in, silver. And then once that was completed, then I just used a lighter silver. This time it was gunmetal. The same gunmetal that I use for my limited palette. Just a simple dry brush to get some of the edges and to do some highlighting. And finally, the last bit that I wanted to do with all this terrain was some of the piping. I wanted to stand some parts of it out a little bit and add a small splash of color to the rest of the terrain, so I went with blue. More specifically, I went with Mediterranean blue by scale 75, and I painted what would be some of the tanks and some of the piping. I didn't pay too much mind as to what is what. I'm sure that I ended up using some electrical piping or some conduit as opposed to some of the gas piping. It doesn't matter. It was kind of haphazard and different areas, and I thought that would look good with a little bit of color. That's what I did. This did take a little bit of time going in with each individual area, making sure I didn't make or made as few mistakes as possible, and covering up all of the, bits that I wanted to be blue. And once all of that was complete, it looked pretty good. It looked kind of chalky and a little bit brighter than I wanted to, but we're going to fix that in a moment. But now is where a little bit of Black Magic Craft influence comes in once again, and this time with a wash. I wanted to do a all-over wash of getting everything to be toned down, a little bit dirty, a little bit grungy. These are ruins after all, so I used one of Jeremy's formulas to create my own wash. And what I did for this, and I'll have this video as well linked down below, or at least the one that I used, was a mixture of water, matte medium, and a little bit of acrylic ink. I used some ink, more specifically the black ink, and I mixed that in with, again, water and matte medium. To be more specific, I used about one of these containers, about halfway full of medium, about half of water, and about 2 or so droppers filled of black ink. Oh, and then one tiny drop of dish soap on the top of it to actually help break the surface tension. After all that was done, I shook it up, did a little bit of testing to make sure it was as dark as I wanted, and then slapped it all over the model. If you want to see how I end up making washes and the ways I specifically do it, let me know in the comments and I can get into greater depth with that. However, Jeremy's work is a very, very solid overview on how to do it yourself. Now, this part was messy. I had some cardboard down on my desk. I put rubber gloves on, or a nitrile glove on my hand, just so I didn't get any, ink all over me. Because this is artist ink after all. It's not just like paint. Even though it's water-based, it can still get a little bit messy and do some staining. But I did each piece over one by one, again using a poofy makeup brush to effectively slop and dab this all over the terrain bits. And then once that was dry, I did the same thing, but again, this time with a brown wash. I used dark umber ink, mixed that in the same way I did for the black wash with matte medium and a drop of soap and some water, and I used, the brown. So I focused on the lower third of pretty much all of the terrain to give not only a brown variation, but also to make it look a little bit more real. I also took some of this brown wash mixture and I dabbed it randomly on some of the platforms where the minis could potentially stand, just showing again some places where water might have pooled or dirt might exist. Now this I let set overnight. Each time I did a wash, it did take a bit of time to dry, so I let those sit overnight and come back to and finish up the next day. And that was all done. I was very close to the end. If you wanted, you can just stop here, and the terrain looked just exactly kind of how I wanted it to. But I wanted to go a little bit further. And to do this, I ended up using some of the Dirty Down Effects paints. I used these previously in the St. Celestine statue video, but I mostly used the verdigris and rust effects. Now for the verdigris, I used that on the doors and some of the windows that were painted in the darker bronze, just to again show some more wear and tear. And that turned out fantastic. I didn't go as heavy as I did with the St. Celestine statue, but I did want to show that this has been around for a while and it's starting to look old and worn down. And for some of the metal or iron bits, in that case, I used rust. And I think I might have gone a little bit too far with the rust in some areas. I slopped it all over. Places that would get rusty, some of the platforms, tried to make it seem like it was dripping down some of the sides. And I'm happy with it, though I might have gone a little bit too far in some places. But that's okay, it's terrain, and things can get kind of weird and wild out there in the world. And then once that was dry, then I was very, very happy with how this turned out. It looked fantastic, all the colors popped in the exact way I wanted it to, the verdigris looked good, the rust looked good, and even all the edges and highlights looked very good. But there was one more thing I really needed to do or wanted to do, and that was a varnish. And to seal all of this in, since the craft paint isn't necessarily as strong as, regular miniature paint, and all the other effects can wear off with the oils and sweat and gunk from your hands, and I wanted to preserve this as much as possible, so I used my airbrush actually and used Ultra Matte Varnish by AK. And you can use any varnish really that you have. Any matte varnish would be great, or any varnish in general. But I used the miniature paint that I have, or the varnish, and put that through my airbrush to seal all of this in and do a lot of protection of all of the work in the paint job that I did. And especially since terrain is meant to be used, it's going to get banged up, it's going to get played around with. I didn't want any of this paint to chip off or rub off, so a nice matte varnish can go a long way to help protecting that for playtime for many, many years to come. And then that's kind of it. It didn't take too long at all. It was a pretty simple process of just a lot of dry brushing, a lot of cheap paints, and a little bit of fancy paints and effects. You could be haphazard. You can make a mess. You don't need to be neat. And I think that's kind of what made terrain fun. I don't know why I put off painting terrain for so long. It ended up being pretty fantastic, and I'm actually looking forward to putting this on the tabletop and seeing everything come to life as opposed to just primed plastic. What do you think? Have you painted terrain? Have you built your own terrain? Have you heard of Jeremy and his work? Am I just rambling for no reason? Let me know down below. Tell me your thoughts, and we can see what happens and get a conversation going. Thanks again for watching. This is Mediocre Minis, and may the divine light your path.